Ladies and gentlemen, when Harry Potter 7 and all original Star Wars movies fail the Bechdel test where women don't talk about anything other than men, when black people are continually typecast as criminals and women as victims, and when day after day people from minorities see themselves typecasted and offensive representations that are both internalized because of the dominance of those narratives in the media, but also affect their daily lives. So people cross the street because when they see black people, because they assume that those narratives are true. Well, we say the government must intervene. So what are we doing in today's debate? We say currently, generally male, white, and heteronormative writers create media much like themselves. They conceive of heroes that are like themselves because they associate that. Under us, what we want them to do is to form a narrative first and then craft to the actors who are selected by a blind test. This would happen everywhere, except where race, gender, and sexuality is an important feature. So we would say that The Wire would stay the same, because its depiction of the struggle of African Americans was incredibly important, but would be happy for Hamlet to be played by everyone. What am I going to talk to you about in this speech? 3 ideas. Firstly, principally, why this is a legitimate intervention in media and art by the government. Secondly, why this is so harmful, why the construction of these dominant narratives is so harmful. And thirdly, why we get change. Let's look first at the principle. Because we say currently media portrays are incredibly unequal. We encounter massive amounts of stereotypes, like the ones I talked about in my introduction. And we don't encounter pluralistic conceptions of race and gender and sexuality in the mainstream. That's incredibly significant, because the majority of people don't have access to alternative forms which require more money, which require more subscriptions, which may not be available in their area. We say that often these have an implicit, if not an explicit, racial bias. And regardless of the intent, those cause massive amounts of harm from both the internalization in the people that they are typecasting, but also in everyone else in society who assumes that those narratives are dominant, who assumes that those narratives are representative and homogenous on the entire community. We say that clearly the influence of those massive large media organisations is not the same. So Channel 9 has far more effect on the Australian construction of narratives within Australia than the alternative narratives presented by SBS. We say that secondly, the government identifies and understands that portrayals in the media are incredibly significant. So we ban hate speech, we ban discrimination, we ban and we limit defamation, because we understand that the media has an unbelievable amount of power to shape and change our understanding. Given that, and we said, given the government has a clear interest in equality and pluralism, because under pluralism people can form conceptions of their own identity and conceptions of their own life that have meaning to them, that are unique, and that give them the most value in their life. We say that quite clearly when the government identifies that there is a massive, unequal, and harmful propagation of a dominant narrative, it has a duty to intervene, just as it does with hate speech. We would say secondly, and principally, there is only an instrumental, we said that speech always has an instrumental value. We're not taking away people's right to speech. We're taking away the implicit fact that they are typecasting or denigrating minorities in their construction of media. In this rights analysis, we would say that we should always defer to the ability of minorities not to suffer that bias, not to have a life that is typecasted and to have to internalize that oppression. That's incredibly important in this debate. Given that we know that these portrayals are unequal, and given that we know that governments intervene in instances where they identify that, or identify harm, and speech does have an instrumental value, principally, the government does have an obligation to intervene, and is legitimate in doing so. But secondly, why the construction of these stereotypes so harmful? I talked about stereotypes like the white hero, or the nerdy Asian, or the woman victim, or the fact that where African Americans are protagonists, they are almost always goofy and don't adhere, aren't serious and aren't actually forwarding the narrative. The fact that in every Law and Order, most Law and Order episodes, the criminal is black or poor, we'd say that that's incredibly harmful. But firstly, there is a natural reinforcement of these biases in the construction of narratives. I told you writers tend to write about their own life experience because it's easier to write about characters that reflect on your own. And because there is a commercial incentive to conform to dominant narratives as they persisted, which are white, which are heteronormative, which are masculine, we think quite clearly writers do adhere to that. We would say that secondly, it's incredibly pernicious to the people who are exposed and consume that media because it's not like they're critically watching. They're not watching it to confirm or to challenge, or like generally, to challenge their own racial stereotypes, particularly in the mainstream. So they are passively accepting and internalising these norms, particularly when in the mainstream they are not confronted on anywhere like a regular basis. We would say the existence of 5% counter-narrative versus 95% dominant narrative doesn't change perceptions and doesn't change the fact that every single day they are seeing a message that enforces something harmful. But like, as I said as well, access to alternative media is always hard. It's generally expensive. HBO subscriptions are hard to come by. But we'd say that minorities also find it genuinely hard to create or to form narratives that are meaningful for themselves because they're shut out of an industry that is constructed around those norms. We would say thirdly, and this is harmful, like both the people who are being oppressed and the oppressive society internalises that oppression. So internalization of oppression is where you conform to that stereotype, which does massive harm to those people because they don't see diverse narratives. They don't see life for themselves out of that conception. And to the extent that they rebel, it's always harder because society tells them that's what your race does. That's what your minority does. You need to be a camp gay. You need to be a butch lesbian, and you can't challenge that if you do because that's what the media is telling me is right. But fourthly, and this is incredibly important, you can't change these narratives from within the industry because the industry is controlled by the oppressor. To the extent that the Film Advisory Board in the US is run by a bunch of old white people who rate lesbian sex far highly on, like, in terms of rating and thus limit the access and exposure of people look at versus heterosexual sex, or the Academy Awards, which are also very old and white people, which encourage consumption of dominant narratives rather than alternative narratives. And when they are alternative, they still succumb to some idea or some stereotypical conception of what it is to be a part of that minority. But thirdly, why do we get change? We say that given that we told you media has an incredible ability to shape perception, we immediately diversify the mainstream. Because we say you can't typecast in the same way. You have to form narratives that are on their own genuinely interesting, but also have a series of diverse characters behind it. And because people will still watch these things because the stories will be great. You don't think generally when you go to the movies, you do so to have your racist ideas confirmed, but it does happen implicitly. So we say people are going to seek it out. And to the extent that when the Gina Davis Institute interviewed men about the lack of female representation in narratives, a lot of the men were really surprised. They just didn't realise or hadn't actually thought about the fact that, hang on, where are the female protagonists? But secondly, we encourage pluralistic identity because when you don't have to cede to a dominant narrative, you get a inherent diversity because people will form narratives that are of their own interesting and are different. We think that's incredibly important to tell people from these minorities that they can have a life that doesn't cede to what the mainstream says. Thirdly, and this is and we think this is quite a significant way we get change. We get intergenerational change because, as we saw, kids generally consume because they have proportionally greater effect of media as they've experienced less. That media has more effect on them. So, to the extent that under the status quo, at the age of 6, people internalise gender norms, we would say that under ours, at the age of 6, they won't internalise those norms. They will see a diverse range of characters. They will see a diverse range of heroes. We think they're far more likely to accept, and we've seen in the trajectory of perceptions that they are changing, but it's always a struggle against a dominant and oppressive industry. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that principally the government has a legitimate right to intervene. We told you that this change can't occur from an industry that has both commercial self-interest and is controlled by the oppressor. But when we force them to blind cast, when we force them to choose people from diverse backgrounds, we get that change. We change perceptions, and we allow people to form lives that are meaningful to them. We propose.
Race and gender is an important part of how individuals experience life. Because for as many movies as there are that reduce Asian women to a math nerd, There are movies that explore the difficulties of navigating immigration to a new country, of learning a new language and culture while being economically and politically insecure. We think that when this story is told, it is important that this is an Asian woman who is cast in that role rather than any generic person. Because it is important that Asian women see this and see that their experiences are shared. And it is important that there is a social consciousness that explores the diverse range of experiences that gender and race makes us experience. In creating ciphers, which can be filled with literally anyone, you strip the nuance of what it means to be an Asian immigrant in the 21st century. And we think that nuance is essential to art, and art is essential to creating a holistic understanding of the different people in our society. I'm going to do three things in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how their model is effective in increasing diversity and minority representation. Then I'm going to talk about why it actually leads to worse representation and empowerment of minorities. And lastly, about why race and gender are important to artistic expression. So why is their model ineffective in the first place? Firstly, because even if Hollywood can purport to have blind casted people, you can never read the minds of those directors, and those directors are always able to say that blind casting occurred when actually they were just pandering to what will be popular. They conceded that Hollywood was dominated by people who are rich, who are white, who are old. And we think that they will just pander to making movies that are popular by casting conventionally attractive men and women in action movies. Because an action movie that depicts George Clooney in a role will automatically attract more people than one who features a relatively unknown Asian woman in the same role. We think furthermore that the acting industry, especially in America, is dominated by white people anyway. So if you make a lottery a reason to cast, by a sheer numbers game, you will have more white people in those roles. We think that currently, people like Will Smith, like Lucy Liu, have gained prominence because they were prominent people in their sector, because biopics that were about black men have cast them. We think that affirmative action needs to happen to make sure that minorities are included in our narratives rather than leaving it to a lottery where the majority will always dominate our conceptions of life. The rest of my rebuttal is going to be integrated. So, they talked about why stereotypes are really harmful, why it oppresses minorities. In this point, I'm going to prove to you that actually your model leads to a worse and more simplistic representation of minorities. Because, Mr. Speaker, entrenched stereotypes about what racial groups and what genders are already entrenched in the social consciousness. Society thinks there are two kinds of Asian women as they are depicted in film. There is the lotus blossom and then there is the aggressive dragon lady. But, so this means that even if a film could be about anyone achieving, for example, political or artistic success, it is really important that affirmative action occurs and casts an Asian woman in that role, because it changes the social consciousness, such that the public can now recall to mind a well-rounded and talented and successful Asian woman. The surprise that Lucy Liu was cast as Sherlock's sidekick was really good, because it showed that Asian women were more than the ciphers that they're normally reduced to in Western narratives. We think therefore this is important for broadening a conception of what these minority groups are, and we think it's also important as a role model effect, because now you as one of the members of that minority can identify with that group. We think that we don't want to replace the kind of affirmative action that occurs when historical events, movies about historical events or biopics actively have to cast black people or Asian women or transgender people in certain roles. On to my second point about why race and gender are important to accurate artistic expression. Mr. Speaker, when you have an artistic vision and when you conceive of a story, you have a picture in your mind of what race and what gender people in those stories are. We don't think people conceptualize of stories as like these blank people going through these generic life activities, right? Like you make movies about experiences that happen in real life, and people are different races and different genders in real life. We think like the fact that Blue Jasmine is about a white upper class woman in the 21st century, while it could have cast like an Asian or a black female or even a white man in the place of Cate Blanchett, it was a narrative that explored the concerns of this very specific class of people, and it showed people what their lives were like. We think in the same way that like Othello could have easily been about a white girl, such as a lot of Shakespeare's plays were. There's like a part of the poignancy of Othello comes from that touching image of a black and rugged man who is like doesn't know the ways of civil society, falling in love with a white woman who like has a completely different life. And we think that that is what creates the real sadness of that play. Race and gender, in your model, you say that race and gender are not meaningful characteristics, should not impact the way people experience life. But we think that's just simply not true to the experiences that everyone in this room has. We think that we think also, if you just create generic people that everyone can fill, the power that is entrenched in the media today means that that generic person will be designed along the lines of entrenched white privilege standards. And it means that this now strips the meaningful experience of being different. Because if you make generic figures that can be filled by anyone, you just turn all Asian women into being white men who and we stand for women that actively denounce this model rather than recreating it, and we think it's really important that this diversity exists. On to my third point about how this racializes the way in which audiences approach art. So, when you have put in government policy that art should be viewed through a racial lens because you have implicated a policy that explicitly does this, we think that the messaging effect and the public perception is to become racially conscious when you watch art, is to think of whether blind casting has occurred. And we think that's really bad because it means that you no longer view the people in that narrative as real. You see them as being like a part of social engineering. You no longer see that narrative as being particularly true or particularly relevant to any experiences you have in life because it just exists as an instrument to make sure that minority people are represented, however, in the worst possible way. Mr. Speaker, we showed you that art was important because it portrays what it means to be a person in the 21st century. Race and gender is always going to be part of how you experience life. We're proud to oppose.
As a straight, white male, it was disgusting that by the time I was 5, Disney had taught me that the prince is the one who should always save the princess. That the only meaningful relationships at the end of that encounter was a heterosexual one, and all of the characters were white. It would have been even worse if I was someone who actually identified with one of those minority groups, because I would have internalized the fact that I was not normal, or that I was not what I should, people should aspire to be. But also, I had to live in a society where people thought that I was somehow different or not acceptable, or somehow was subverting their identity. We thought that the Disney films produced under our model wouldn't reinforce these types of detriments. Not because they would make everyone like homogenous white men, but because they would ascribe the qualities that are currently only ascribed to white men to all types of people. So you'd have women who were able to save men. You would have gay people which were able to find love at the end of the film. You would have like black people in films which are targeted to children. All things which don't happen and all things which can only be benefits on our side of the house. They wanted to say that there was a homogenous idea of white men. What we thought the idea of white men was in our society were people that were overly respected, were people that like we assumed power should be like given to, were people who actually were able, like one of the only groups in our society, to identify like the conception of their masculinity or that was like which was unique to them. So I'll be getting on to 3 points of integrated, substantial, and rebuttal, and the first of those are whether or not this allows like positive narratives of race and of minorities. Firstly, they said it was really important that there exist films which talk about racial struggle. It was important that we told you at first step in our model that these were the types of films which we were excluding from our policy because it was inherently important to them that you didn't have like white people playing the oppressed black minority in the white. We thought that that was something which we were smart enough to preempt in prep and didn't apply in this debate. But also, like, it's just not true that there's an equal number of empowering texts about black people as there are empowering texts about white people. Like, I can name the text in the canon, like, on one hand that empower black people. It's like To Kill a Mockingbird, and I mean, like, structural reasons why the people who wrote these books all through history have been white men. The people who are writing these texts in Hollywood right now are white men. The people directing these texts are white men. And they don't explicitly want to be racist, but when your conceptions of like who a hero is always going to be influenced like by the people that you've experienced in your life who are heroes who happen to be white, and the people in history who have been heroes who also happen to be white men, that is what happens. So even even if our model somehow did exclude these, just like on force of numbers, the benefit was on our side of the house. But also, they want to say that it's really dangerous because there's currently only 2 conceptions of an Asian woman, like the lotus and the dragon lady. That was what we were getting in the media currently. We thought you'd get so many more conceptions of what an Asian person could be if, like, Hamlet was an Asian woman once in a while. We thought there was nothing about Hamlet being played in theatres which meant that he had to be a man. That story still speaks to your humanity just as much if it's an Asian lady. That story still speaks to shared common experiences by humans if that was the case. Like, they have to come out and tell us why there is some sort of value in always ascribing the values of like the past or the values of a majority onto society forevermore. Then they came out and model bashed and said like, it's really hard to blind cast. Like, let's remind you that like sometimes, especially in like musical theatre, like you literally are blind casting, you cannot see the person. Like, think The Voice here, guys. But also, even if it wasn't actually like blind casting, what our model does is offer recourse to the court. So like people, if they think they've been racially like vilified, can go to the courts and say, hey, this is against the law. The standard of proof changes so that the companies and the producers actually have to prove that their decision was not one of race. That side, and it's important to be comparative here, had literally no recourse for those people. Then they said, but most actors are white, your model will just pick randomly white people. Most actors are white because black people don't think that they can get jobs as actors. When we change that calculus, when we tell them you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of your race, you get more black people or people from minorities actually wanting to be actors because they think it might be a worthwhile thing which will have consequences like later on in the future for them, and there will be career development. Then they said it's important that people are able to identify with conceptions and narratives of their race. They gave us very, very little analysis about why those narratives put forward in the media were valid narratives when they were not even set by people from that community. We actually told you that a lot of those narratives were not deliberately oppressive, but were just in terms of the assumptions that they propagated. Like, every time I click on Law and Order and I see like a black person or a Latino person is the criminal and not the detective, that is really harmful for the way that I think about minorities, but more importantly, the way that minorities are treated by people like me. Anyway. We also thought that it was really, really harmful for them to claim on their side of the house that like there's a big deal when an Asian person gets a big role, like Lucy Liu. On our side of the house, we get things like Lucy Liu not being the female Asian sidekick who used to be a doctor, but perhaps maybe being Sherlock Holmes one day. Because there's nothing about this Sherlock Holmes that means you have to be an Englishman, that means you have to be a male, and we thought it'd be really important and really useful for conceptions of race. We didn't always assume that that was true. Then it's also important to remember that they wanted to point at like random disparate films like Blue Jasmine and say that that was useful. On the balance of probabilities, we think we'd get more texts that actually challenge norms and narratives than just like waiting around for films like Blue Jasmine to come about. Like, that's really hard to happen. We told you that there are incentives for that not necessarily to happen very often. Like, the economic incentive is obvious. If the majority of people have a majority narrative about race, the way that you sell and get the most economic profit is just to pander to that majority view about race. Like, we thought you'd get more Blue Jasmines just by chance because we were blind casting like females into strong male roles which had previously always been male dominated. I'll now get on to my point of substandard, which didn't fit into those other two issues, which is why it changes internal incentives. We think that artists and writers are often lazy and simply regurgitate norms under status quo. Firstly, big producing companies just don't have the incentive to take risks, and they don't have the same types of, like, they don't have any incentive to promote equality within the society, which means they're more likely to pander to dominant narratives. But also, like, even if they wanted to change these norms, it means that they weren't armed with the type, like, they couldn't go to their producer and say, maybe we should start changing norms, because even if they all wanted to, the economic incentives just weren't there. This really changes, and this speaks to what they talked about, like, being homogenous, because you don't create stories based around narratives of race, you start creating stories based around narratives of a shared humanity. Like, it's not true that everyone will just start looking like a white man, because when they said, what is a white man, we really wanted to ask, what was that in our society? It meant that, like, it was someone that people respected, like, people expected to provide and do things proactively, a powerful person and a valuable person. We just wanted there to be more, like, that would only, like, that wouldn't just stay in the realm of the white person. Like, there's a nuanced conception of men currently in the media which isn't applied to women, and we just wanted to extend that nuance to all different types of minorities. Also, this top-down approach will actually affect change, because when you know that sometimes you have to appoint black actors or Asian or Asian actresses or things like that, you start giving those people the potential for professional development. Because you can no longer just like only go to like the same recruiting academies and only go to the same agents who you know or like are close friends with because of your community, who only produce like the types of actors from that community. You know that you'll need to have the types of people who can fulfill what our model is forcing these producers to fulfill. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not good enough that our current media like promotes these horrible narratives about race. These narratives about race are set by people not from those communities. They internalise oppression and they are treated terribly for it. We beg to propose.
In this debate, instead of propping the motion, what Sydney wanted to defend was why it is good to remove racial prejudices in art. Obviously, we agree that those racial prejudices were bad. We agreed with their analysis about why they were bad. What we told you was that they were ineffective at best and harmful at worst. And that was why we don't think that that material was able to be persuasive in this debate. Because they weren't defending the removal of those racial prejudices, those gender preferences in art. They were defending a very specific kind of government intervention to try and amend those things. And what the government intervention posited was the idea that we could imagine a person in an artistic vision that was stripped of all their most important characteristics. That we could posit someone in our piece of art that was stripped of their gender, of their race, of their sexuality. We thought that that was implausible, we thought that it limited artistic expression, and most importantly, we thought that person would just be couched in terms of the white values, the colour, our image of what a generic person means. That's why we don't think they got the meaningful change that they wanted. So I'm going to address two questions in this debate, in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to look at whether they achieved the plurality of different perspectives on race that they wanted, and secondly, I'm going to look at how audiences change their interpretation of the depiction of race, independent of that other mechanism. Before I move on to that, I want to quickly discuss what we think the impact that Sydney's model has on like a very surface empirical level. We thought they were very ambiguous and confusing. enthusiasts, to what they thought constituted a justified basis upon which to appoint a member of a particular racial group. Because as Jesse told you, every experience that you have is coloured by your race. The most important thing about you is the changes experiences you have are defined by your race. So we thought that it was possible that they wouldn't succeed in rejecting anything under their model, which would obviously make their model extremely ineffective. But if they weren't doing that, then all our other harms manifested. Even if their model didn't reject any films, the harms we brought you about artistic discretion still came out. Then at second speak, we had the interesting idea that their model would work by making the auditions like literally blind. We thought that was probably plausible for like making a film or a stage production. So they're taking just to move into this bizarre paradigm they create. Presumably you could tell if it's a woman or a black person by their voice. There are characteristics. So we didn't think that was even particularly effective. Alright, so does the model create a plurality of depictions of members of minorities? But we've got a whole lot of reasons why we don't think it does. We think we've received scant engagement. The first reason is the one I just told you, that it was unclear on what basis you would ever allow reject a text for being based on race, given that every experience is coloured by race. Secondly, as Jesse told you, you cannot read the minds of the people who are doing these casting decisions. You have no idea upon what basis they're making that decision. In fact, the person doing the casting might even know the basis upon which they're doing that decision, given that it is coloured by biases of which they're not actually cognizant. The only response we heard was that somehow courts can magically perform this for us. We didn't think courts had the capacity to scrutinise the artistic vision of that artist in a way that would allow them to, in any meaningful way, say whether or what basis that decision was made. Thirdly, we'd say that what they supported was the idea that we can create these generic narratives inhabited by these bizarre, non-gendered, non-racial people, and then we can craft that narrative about those people after we cast them, which implies that all of their harms about typecasting could just happen after that point, after you've already cast about them, then typecast them. Fourthly, finally, we'd say that casting is not the be-all and end-all of who ends up in films, that films that are led by black people or women or homosexuals are likely to be mass-marketed less by Hollywood, are likely to be picked up by distribution networks less than Hollywood. All that happens after the fact, and you do nothing to stop that. We think their model does almost nothing for the people they were trying to help, and that's why we thought that our harms were the decisive ones in the debate. Alright, so we didn't think, even if they did get a plurality that they wanted, even in the best case scenario, we thought it was a plurality that was actively harmful. Because as Jesse told you, the initial artistic generic vision you have of this de-racialized, de-gendered person is defined by white heteronormative ideas about what the ideal is. That means that you say things like, the white bourgeoisie values of professionalism are inculcated into these people. The heteronormative conceptions of monogamy are inculcated into these people. You create an ideal for members of minorities that is not relevant to them. You encourage them to aspire to institutions that they don't control. All of those things just strip them of their ability to define their own identity and instead impose a white identity on them instead. We think that's incredibly harmful. David did this when he said that what they supported on their side of the house was attributing characteristics to these people that we already attribute to white men. We thought that that conceded the fact that these people were going to be interpreted in the absolute best case scenario for your team under really harmful narratives and under value sets that weren't relevant to those people. We also told you that this plurality would restrict artistic expression. We thought that meant that you would massively limit the ability for us to live in a society where people made good works of art, because we thought that good art was when you were able to realize a good artistic vision, and that artistic vision required you to have a vision of real experiences, of the real world we experience, where people do have gender, where people do have race, because we don't live in a world that is inhabited by these bizarre, generic, Asian woman Hamlets. We live in a world of gender and race, and that's just reflected in the artistic representations we have of that world. But we also thought that the limit in your ability to actualize an artistic vision specifically limited your ability to actualize an artistic vision about minorities, because you couldn't explore female experiences if you didn't have the ability to write a film in the best possible way that was about women and explore those experiences. Blue Jasmine was Blue Jasmine because it was about women. It wasn't because it was about strong characters. It explored what it means to be a sister and a mother and a wife, and those are things that are different and are not the same for members of other classes. So how does this change audience interpretation of race, which is my second question. The best case scenario, where you get the pluralities that they want, we think it's still incredibly harmful, because as Jesse told you, this encourages audiences to view art through the lens of race, because you send a message that the government is saying that race is important, race is the metric we should use for how we should define casting and the way we define characters. That's harmful for a whole bunch of reasons. Firstly, because you brand films as being about a specific racial group. If I want to write a story about a gay man, I have to go to the government and say, this is why this story should be about a gay man. And that brands that film as being reduced to just being about the gayness of that character. Rather than thinking about something that person as a human. It essentializes them to their raw characteristics rather than engaging with them in the most nuanced possible way that captures their experience. Even for like the broader range of films, for the like everyday films, you have a broader impact because you encourage audiences to constantly view characters and constantly view actors through a racial lens and constantly scrutinize the racial casting of those characters. Which means even if they are in diverse roles, even if you got the best characterization from the other side of the house, the audience will view them in a more essentialized way because that's the lens that they've been encouraged by this policy to do that, which means that they don't see them as human beings, they see them as black people or women. And we thought that that meant that the best case scenario for that side of the house, all they were able to achieve was to encourage a perspective on these people that reduced them to their race even more. So, Mr. Speaker, we thought that we won this debate on every conceivable level. We didn't think it was plausible. If it was plausible, we didn't think it was effective. If it was effective, there were other harms that outweighed the initial things they were trying to solve. And that's why we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Mr. Chair, we think you end discrimination when you can see a black woman as a CEO in a movie and that is nothing strange. When you see people who come from minorities that have traditionally been discriminated against as people who are empowered, as people who are leaders, and there is no commentary because that is just accepted as fact. We'd say that the way they've characterised how a model plays out is good because even if it may be more generic in some cases, which would also contend, you at least show people in positions of empowerment, and that means people who come from those minority backgrounds no longer just have a single vision of themselves as the oppressed. They can see themselves as leaders, they can aspire to that, and that's why that was so important to them. Two issues. Firstly, what is the current problem and how are we fixing it? Secondly, why we get better results for ending discrimination. So, we told you from the start of this debate, media was fundamentally unequal and that wasn't changing any time unless we put in this top-down restriction. It wasn't pluralistic because 80% of directors were white males and 60% of writers were white males. They had stereotypes that were implicitly ingrained with them and they were not challenging them because there was no incentive to do so. We thought artists were often lazy and just not understanding this challenge, which was why we thought making them aware would believe that they would be more willing to opt into our system and also perpetuate the change. Because we thought currently there was a harmful stereotype that people thought that a movie from Marvel Comics, which had a female starring in it, would not sell compared to other movies. We eliminate the masculine conceptions of heroism and have those replaced by people who are non-traditional heroes. There is no alternatives to your face. You must consume media which is portraying minorities in empowerment, and that was always going to be a benefit. Because the current harm, people were internalizing these dominant narratives. And we never saw from from their side how they're going to change it. How they're going to stop all portrayals of women in G movies as being sexy people who have no roles and who were never involved in business, in politics, in science, or as engineers, because that was the current system. So, there was no alternative except for our system, because they agreed it was bad, but then had no mechanism to change it. And James told you why it wasn't changing, because there was access problems. When they were talking about the ability to have other types of media, there were huge costs involved. And when you had to contend against Hollywood, that everyone wanted to see, and was not opting into the model unless we had our system, you never got the majority seeing alternative conceptions and being able to internalize them. The Academy Awards were run by white males, so were the classification boards. We need to make sure we're actually changing it through our model, which I'll get to in a second. But the problem was that they weren't willing to accept that our model was legitimate. In that, the fact that we said we would be willing, as a government standing against ending oppression in media, to show TV shows or movies which dealt with the issue of oppression through traditional frameworks. So of course you can have stories of an Asian woman migrant fighting for her acceptance in society. Of course you can show black slavery with black slaves. We thought any other thing that didn't directly deal with oppression was perpetuating oppression unless we changed the characters up, which is why we were doing that. That's why there was still To Kill a Mockingbird, but we thought Ender's Game could have instead been cast with homosexual people, so you challenge Orson Scott Card's homophobia. That was benefits under our house. Because what did they say on this? They said that principally you should be able to have this freedom of expression. We thought that didn't count when you were perpetuating struggle. So when they wanted to talk about Blue Jasmine, that was a movie that got a white woman an Academy Award or whatever, but it did nothing to improve the challenges to people who have been discriminated against. And it came at an opportunity cost that while you're producing this mass media, there's no interest to perpetuate stuff which is good for minorities. So that was the cost when you're talking about that. We also thought in net benefit you get more movies with women under our system because of blind casting making it different. So why is our model going to be effective? They said it wasn't going to work. Firstly, issues of enforcement. We said it was pretty obvious if you were getting out of the system, and we created a legal mechanism for you to sue directors and casters who were not putting you into things. We thought we could also put in independent casting observers. We thought you could make shortlists and then randomly select from those shortlists which kind of actor you would get, and then have a dialogue to shape that, as we told you from first. When they wanted to say the harm was, oh, there are just so many white males, Gabe already told you you're more likely to get minorities going into movie industry when they see that industry is more welcoming to them and it wants them. It's basically setting up a kind of prison system. But we also thought that it was very important to get different changes, because they had this weird tension in their case. Because at one moment they said that you're just going to be getting Asian women who will be shown as white men, but then also they said that there'll be a centralized and a minority when you have to go to the government and say, I'm making a movie about a gay person, it's just about a gay person, which we thought was weird from their side. But what would say that under the system, when you are trying to create a movie about gay struggle, you are going up to a government who has actively put in a policy which is aimed to help minorities. We think under that system you feel empowered to be able to say, I have this story, and you have a government that's receptive to making sure you're allowed to produce that story, to get all the stories that challenge hegemonic perceptions of white culture and sexist culture. So we thought we got a better portrayal under our side, because you would be getting more diverse range just by the fact that you had to blind cast and you had to sometimes have the main character who wasn't who you originally thought you would cast. We thought that it meant that you broke down stereotypes of traditional forms because you had to be different to stand out. We thought that you've got more interesting stories when people have to play around with things. And the fact that it would be boring if every movie suddenly became about, oh, I'm gay, my struggle coming out. We thought it was far more normal, that they try to gloss over the fact that they're gay in some instances and just say it's normal, accept them as a normal person rather than as a gay person. And that's why we thought it got better than that. But we also thought we would be still happy for you to say stories that focus on that, because that's good for a broader understanding of the oppression people experience and is a great way to get people to empathize with us. We thought it was so important when you're suddenly able to slot in people who are traditionally oppressed into positions of privilege in media, because it showed people that you were able to get that and challenge those norms that people just couldn't do things because they were inherently of a certain race or a certain gender. So, the final thing that they want to say was that our model was going to be harmful because of the portrayals that we were going to get. I've already mentioned this as a bit, but we thought it's always good, even if you're not dealing specific with the action, you're more likely to internalize things when you see differences. So the fact that as a woman you cannot see women in industries such as science, such as technology, such as engineering, such as maths, means you are unlikely going to those industries as the future. We think just the fact that you automatically say, show women as scientists, without even any commentary on that, you get an internalization of that norm, and you're shifting the story and the ability to say, your ability to engage that in the future. That challenges oppression in an important way. But also, we thought you had to often engage with those to make the plot story good. There was engagement, we always said, between rechanging the story to adapt to the actors you had to make those stories realistic so they're good for the people. So we thought that's how you got diverse conceptions. You either just show them as normal people or you commented on their stories so you got more diversity. Either way, that happened. That was good. We think that race can be very important to you, but it shouldn't be important to how stories are portrayed. We say that that is totally arbitrary where you come from in any story, and that's why we wanted to show Hamlet with an Asian woman, because it challenged conceptions in society, because it made you rethink your biases. We thought you got confronted, and then you started to accept it as it became the norm in media that people were not automatically white male heroes. Mr. Speaker, they told us that our model wasn't going to work for a few reasons. Those were wrong because we were automatically getting difference in media. We thought difference was the biggest problem when you had the barriers of only white males writing those stories and creating those stories. If you force them to play with new actors, new characters, you've got to change which challenged hegemony and have real results. We never had a way that we'd fix this oppression otherwise. We were proud to propose.
Mr. Chair, it was never our burden on our side of the House tonight to prove that we ended the oppression of minorities. Rather, Mr. Speaker, we told you that it was up to the affirmative team that we told you the problems were, number one, that they was never able to solve the oppression of minorities because of the efficacy problems of their model, which I'll elaborate. And number two, even if they were able to generate some marginal benefits by having more black CEOs, so as they claim, we told you that the overall damages on the actual perception of racial identity, artistic expression, and the appearance of the problem in society far outweigh these incentives. So, Mr. Speaker, we think it was really problematic that what the third affirmative wanted to hang their hat on was the appearance of lots of black CEOs. We thought it just reinforced the idea of applying what is respected for white men and applying those values to black women. We don't think black women need to be CEOs to be respected. They can be respected in ways that white people are not necessarily respected. We thought it was really a problem for the opposition. They wanted to push the values on which white society is respected onto these black people. And we told you, Mr. Speaker, that when you actually do that, the problem is you mask the actual structural problems in society. So when you have films in which you have lots of black CEOs, people won't actually think it's the norm. And why is that bad? Because, Mr. Speaker, we all know that it actually isn't the norm, and it's actually masked the underlying cultural problems in society. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, it took away the fact that she was actually a black woman and just focused on a superficial status as being a CEO, Mr. Speaker. So because we were proud to support racial identity and not just support some generic conception of a person with superficial white titles, that is why the debate fell to us, Mr. Chair. So let me ask you three questions, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, is their model, and what is the efficacy of their model, and will it actually lead to positive outcomes? Number two, how does their model deal with the existing discrimination of minorities in film that both sides of the House agreed on today? And thirdly, how does their model impact on artistic expression? So on to this first point of the efficacy of the model. Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the things they told us was that it's actually fine because we have a system of courts to do it. Mr. Speaker, even if we bought that analysis, which was flimsy at best, because we believe that in Hollywood, the directors had the power because they made the casting decision, not these actors who were signing up for the job. So there's giant power balance. But even if we accept that the courts mitigated it, there was material in Tom's speech that casting wasn't the only mechanism through which these kind of minorities were to be promoted. promoted, and that casting was actually a really insignificant mechanism, because even if they are casting some kind of roles, if the film is distributed and promoted on the existing white men in the film, then this casting mechanism was kind of really irrelevant, because when people decide whether they want to watch the film, they see the poster with like lots of white men in it, they're probably going to go, they're going to judge whether they want to watch it on those white men and not on the existence of other people which may have been there through their policy of AA. The second thing I want to tell us, Mr. Speaker, is that their model actually encourages black actors and like other minority actors into the acting business. Two responses to that. Like number one, that was contingent on them proving that in the status quo, these kind of minority actors are unwilling to engage in this sort of job because they feel there is actual oppression. And we thought it was contradicted by the fact that they told us that the reason we don't have many black actors is because they're not interested in it. But secondly, we say, Mr. Speaker, that even if that was true, they did nothing to solve the underlying problem as to why black actors were being discriminated against. I mean, Berta Furman just made up some lobby statistics that like 80% of writers are white or something. Like that never changed on that side of the house. So that is why we thought that like if you were a black actor and the writers were all still white, even if they had some superficial policy of black casting, from a perspective of a black actor, these are still a white guy making that decision. We never heard why they were more incentivized to join that. Then we move on to the second question, perhaps the most important question, and is, does their model actually address the problem of discrimination against minorities? So the first thing they told us was the best way to overcome this kind of denigration was to remove this idea of race, just to create this kind of idea that people are just generic people removed from the racial identity. Two responses to that. We said number one, we feel that races are a really crucial part of people's identity. And when we removed that and just focused on superficial titles such as CEOs, that was really harmful to that racial group, like number one. And secondly, we told you about the audience's interaction and perception of film, something that was never responded to by third affirmative. Tom told you, when people see the government has instituted a racial policy on films, they're now going to see all films through a racialized lens. And that is bad because now they interpret these films in that way, and that was never engaged with by the opposition's case. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, they never, like, even if under the best case, like under the opposition's model, we had more like black women being portrayed in acting roles, they never told us why they were necessarily being portrayed in empowering roles, Mr. Speaker. We tell you that the really significant roles in a film rely on strong character development, and racial identity is a mechanism through which you achieve strong character development, and that is why race is important to strong roles. But like for little minor roles where you don't have much character development, we agree that race might not be important. So what their model actually did, even if it encouraged more black actors, it just encouraged them into the really minor roles, because they weren't reliant on racial identity, and you can just fit in generic people, so that was a harm on their side of the case. So they missed the speech. So then we move on to this last point of artistic expression. So like, one of the major benefits they wanted to talk about was that like what their model will do incentivize the creation of really good narratives and really good plots. The problem here, Mr. Speaker, was that in many cases, the existence of really good plots and really good narratives was contingent on the formation of racial identity. Like without one, you can't have the other. So we thought that that analysis didn't exist. And in response, they gave us the analysis, like at second, as to why in the current status quo, there is no incentive for writers to create new narratives which go against stereotypes because of the issue of economics. Like people are only going to watch films where you have a lot of white men. A couple of responses to that. But Mr. Speaker, while we accepted that mechanism may be true, they never explained why that was changed under their model. So even if we had lots more women in these new films, they never told us why people were going to watch these films with lots of women. So even if we accept that women were actually going to be advertised and not just shown up in the casting role, they never explained why people won't just turn away from these films now because they have a lot of black people. Like if people were really racist and conform to societal stereotypes, surely this economic analysis still applies on their side of the house. And like Mr. Speaker, they told you at first affirmative that they're really clever and that they model this kind of idea out. Because for the films which racial identity was a really important aspect, they had a special exemption to blind actor. But they never responded to Goldie's response to that. And Goldie said that when you're forced to justify your film as fitting the criteria and in which you are able to ignore the blind casting regulation, that meant that your film was now stereotyped as being a film about black people. All the kind of narratives and the plot people, the plots that you wanted to talk about were ignored. It was just now seen as a racialized film. So the majority of the audience would now no longer engage with the film as a piece of art, but now as a piece of, from a racialized lens and through economics, people are unlikely to watch it. So, Mr. Speaker, even if the opposition is able to create more matter with a greater diversity of individuals, they never explain why this matter would be watched and why it would act, and thus, if it's not going to be watched, how it's going to reform these existing societal stereotypes. So, Mr. Speaker, what their model did at best today was change the superficial representation of putting a lot more black people, putting a lot more minorities into really low roles or this roles with really silly titles while ignoring the idea of racial identity. We told you, Mr. Speaker, on our side of the House, that race is a crucial part of forming identity. When you remove this and make people generic and just conform to the pre-existing white stereotypes, that was a harm we were never willing to accept, and that is why we're proud to oppose.